Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for coming. My name is Chris Kennedy. I'm the programmer for Existence's Song, the films of Stan Brakhage, which has been a year-long look at the works of Stan Brakhage. We have 3 more screenings after this one. November 7th, we'll be looking at his painted films. November 14th, we'll be looking at A Child's Garden in the series C, which is a film that he made in Victoria. And the final films will be showing on December 11th, I believe, but double check the website for that one. And thank you today for coming to Mystical Affinities, the female perspectives on Stan Brakhage. It's been an enlightening year to look at Stan Brakhage's film. They're, of course, extraordinary. There's some beautiful, intimate films and some really wonderful pushes of the form. But there's no question that his work, especially in the experimental film canon, has benefited from the great man theory of art, and that's kind of the theory that he himself was very good at promoting of his work. He was the central figure for many years. And so at this moment, I think it's important to acknowledge that and to say that, you know, we're collectively trying to shift the context of assumed histories. So why don't we look at things differently? So this afternoon is an attempt to do some of that in relationship to his work. And I very much thank our guests, Ara Osterweil and Kalpana Subramanian, and Izabella Pruska-Oldenhof, who is actually here, will also be here. She's got a film in the program. All of them will join us presenting and showing and then talking as a Q&A to kind of present their frames on his work so that we can all kind of collectively investigate his work a little bit further. Ara joins us from Montreal, where she's an associate professor of cultural studies and world cinema at McGill University. Her book, Flesh Cinema, The Corporeal Turn in American Avant-Garde Film, was published a couple years ago, and it looks extensively at the work of Stan Brakhage, as well as Paul Sharits, Andy Warhol, Barbara Rubin, Yoko Ono, and Carolee Schneemann. Kalpana joins us from Buffalo, where she is pursuing her PhD in media study at the University of Buffalo. Her films include Tatva and the series Light-Mediated Eyes of Brakhage, of which we'll see the film Empyrean. So 2 of her pieces are actually in the program after this. After the talk. So Ara will begin, Kalpana afterwards, then we'll see the films, and then we'll have a time for actually a pretty good Q&A discussion. So thanks again.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming out on a Sunday. It's so nice to be in this beautiful theater compared to the shithole I teach in. And so not the school, but my screening room is just like in shambles, and so nice to see some of my former students here. That's always really special. It's no wonder that Brakhage has been so influential on both male and female artists. While most of today's program explores implicitly Brakhage's work with light, I'm going to be focusing a little bit more on Brakhage's sort of pioneering of the home movie as the highest form of cinematic art, and think about the mutual affinity, mystical affinity, and mutual influence of Brakhage and Carolee Schneemann on each other. So Brakhage, it's like, look at that fancy little remote. Brakhage pioneered or sort of elevated the home movie to the highest level of cinematic achievement. And in doing that, he sort of insisted that what happened in his personal life, what happened with his family, in the bedroom, in the kitchen, outside in the backyard, on top of a mountain in the middle of nowhere in Colorado, mattered as much as the cycles of nature and man's search for God. That the personal mattered. Brakhage would never have said the personal is political, but the personal mattered. And I think that was an enormously influential turn for female artists to take up, and provided a model of this elevation of the domestic and the everyday as the sort of highest goal and achievement of art. We see here, that was, by Brakhage, the famous signature, handwritten signature that we see on all the films, but what this meant by Brakhage, what this meant to him. By Brakhage should be understood to mean by way of Stan and Jane, Brakhage, as it does in all my films since marriage. It is coming to mean by way of Stan and Jane and the children, Brakhage, because all the discoveries which used to pass only through the instruments of myself are coming to pass through the sensibilities of those I love. Someday these passages will extend through the sensibilities of those I now can only imagine loving. Ultimately, by Brakhage will come to be superfluous and understood as what it now ultimately is by way of everything. And that's this real affirmation of the importance of collaboration and of family life in the very creation of his work. One of the things that I want to suggest today is an alternative genealogy for thinking about Brakhage. And I would say this is a more traditional genealogy of seeing Brakhage as either an amorous searcher in a long lineage of romantic poets, or as a modernist investigating the specific ontology of his medium. And so I've paired an image of, what Pollock is to paint, Brakhage is to light. And both of them use this very corporeal way of making their work. Brackage's somatic or bodily camera that he learned from the films of Marie Mencken, Pollock painting as if it was a form of dance, or what Harold Rosenberg called action. And so there's the analogy. So that's the kind of modernist genealogy that sees Brakhage doing for film what the abstract expressionists did for painting, sort of really investigating the characteristics of the medium. But I want to suggest instead, or not instead, but alongside, the kind of mutual influence that Brakhage and Schneemann had on each other in many decades of friendship. We'll stay on that for a moment. So the tumultuous friendship between Carolee Schneemann and Brakhage generated the most highly individualistic, anti-industrial model of personal corporeal filmmaking in the post-war era. And much of Carolee Schneemann's practice during the 60s and 70s was inspired by collaborative relationships with friends and lovers, including Brakhage, the sculptor Robert Morris, and her long-term partners James Tenney and Anthony McCall. But utopian as these notions of collaboration might be, they were often troubled by the social inequities that impacted the potential for radicality and reciprocity that is implied by the term collaboration. Those tensions are nowhere more evident than in the nearly 50-year friendship and relationship between Schneemann and Brakhage. And scholars have predominantly overlooked the influence that Schneemann had on Brakhage, preferring to see the influence that Brackage's work had on Schneemann. But in fact, they were mutually influential on each other, and you could argue, as I have done, that Schneemann's early paintings, of which I'll show you some examples, and her approach to the body were integral to the development of Brackage's signature hand-painted cinema, as well as his decision to focus on the flesh of bodies. And I, in my writing about them, have seen their friendship both as an allegory of the kind of very revealing difficulties that a female artist had working both inside and outside simultaneously of heterosexuality and patriarchy, but also to rethink Brackage's own evolution as a filmmaker. So before Brakhage met Carolee Schneemann in the mid-1950s, he was making black and white trance films, very much inspired by Maya Deren, that were characterized by their existential focus. So that's Schneemann, that's Schneemann's most famous performance piece, Meet Joy. And so I want you to sort of keep this image of tangled flesh in mind as we start seeing some of the Brakhage work. That's an image in color. And this is what Brackage's films looked like before he met her. They focused on a psychologically splintering protagonist. They borrowed chiaroscuro lighting from film noir they had these sort of overwrought psychodramatic premises, as in this film, Desist Film, and they were part of this process of wrenching post-adolescent self-discovery that included Brakhage's own serious consideration of suicide at the age of 26. So that's not the Brakhage that we've come to know. This is early Brakhage, and I would say pre-Schneemann Brakhage. And contemporaneous with meeting both Schneemann and Jane Collum, who Brakhage married in 1957, Brakhage's work turned away from the agonies of the psyche toward the representation of the body. And we see this in Window Water Baby Moving from 1959, a gorgeous documentation of the birth of his and Jane's first child. Shifting away from a Freudian conception of the self that had really dominated his early work towards an investigation of embodied vision, Brakhage began to theorize the visionary capacities of what he called the untutored eye in ways that are remarkably consistent with Schneemann's contemporaneous notion of the eye body. And so this is the famous Brakhage quote. It's actually quite hard for me to read off the screen from this angle. So could one of my former students read this for me? Amazing, thank you. And a little fantasy for me to have you back in my classroom instead of at UT. And Vanessa, could you read this from Carolee? Thank you. So both Brakhage and Schneemann, around 62, 63, they start theorizing this rejection of Western ocular centrism, or the sort of primacy of a concept of the visual that was really distanced from the visual's immersion in the rest of the body. And Schneemann's concept of the eye body embraced the ways in which vision was immersed in and inextricable from corporeality. Now, these quotes are not in any way identical, but they are both sort of insisting on new ways of seeing that were grounded in the physiological and perceptual richness of bodily experience. Now, one of the things that we see in the Schneemann quote is that there's a real focus on gender, whereas in Brakhage's quote, there's a kind of universalizing, right? Imagine an eye, as if an eye could ever be divorced from a gendered body. And in some ways, that was what he imagined, an eye outside of ideology. And Schneemann recognized the impossibility of that. Whereas that was a kind of blinding in Brakhage's own imagination. As early as 1963, in Eye Body 36 Transformative Actions, Schneemann was using her nude body as an extension of her painting constructions, provocations that would continually earn her wrath, derision, and degradation by the phallocentric art world. But her notion of embodied vision, in which there is no sight outside of the body, acknowledged the eye body as an imperfect organ, in a rejection of the Kantian ideal of detached spectatorship. Her work celebrates what it feels like to be a body made of flesh, ecstatic among other invisible beings. Brakhage published Metaphors on Vision in 1963, the same year that Schneemann created this series. And he was also interested in expanding vision beyond the limitations imposed by 19th century Western compositional perspective. And his own early trans film, Reflections on Black from 1955, attempts to convey the somatic blindness as the magic of seeing while dreaming awake. And to do so, he incorporated flashes and film flares from the end of the film roll to mimic what he imagined as the leaking of light experienced by the blind in the peripheral of their eyes. Whether or not that's scientifically accurate, I can't say. But as you see in this still, he also scratched out the surface of the celluloid with a sharp instrument as a way of affirming the physicality of the film material within the context of blind man's vision. And this shift that we see in the sort of beginning to actually mark up and process the celluloid as a physical material property was part of a move toward this investigation of embodied vision that involved a kind of haptic visuality, or a sense that vision itself could be tactile, as though one were touching a film with one's own eyes. And you see this, like actual touching of the film and intervention on the film. And I would say, and Carolee would say, that this, the tactile activity of Schneemann's early painting constructions, you see a little bit here, which incorporated material elements like cloth, paper, wood, nails, fur, glass, influenced Brakhage to start increasing the dimensionality of the celluloid strip through collage, and which eventually led him to shift his palette from the black and white we see in the films from the mid-50s to vibrant color. Most innovatively, Brakhage's embrace of haptic or tactile visuality involved the interrogation of the skin of the film through painting and scratching the surface. It's impossible to understand this merging of painting, film, flesh, and collage in either Brakhage nor Schneemann's work without contextualizing these innovations in their friendship. Schneemann has said, "The condition of affinity, mutual influence, and response are more consistent between Stan's and my work than is normally understood." Schneemann first met Brakhage, that's her in the middle, through her first husband, the American composer James Tenney. Tenney had gone to high school with Brakhage in Denver, Colorado, and in the mid to late 1950s, Schneemann and Tenney were in constant communication with Stan and Jane Brakhage, visiting each other in Colorado and then Vermont and Illinois, and chronicling their stormy friendship in letters. Most of the letters that Brakhage wrote to Schneemann were either burnt by Brakhage or stolen, but the letters that she wrote to him, many of which are included in this wonderful anthology called Correspondence Course by Christine Stiles of Schneemann's letters to various friends and artists over many decades, reveal this sustained and meaningful dialogue that was nonetheless troubled by inequitable gender politics that didn't only characterize their friendship, but that defined mid-century America. In 1975, the year that Schneemann performed Interior Scroll, her famous piece where she stands nude with sort of dabs of paint on her naked flesh and pulls a carefully wound scroll from her vagina and reads from it. She performed that first at the Telluride Film Festival in 1975. Brakhage invited her to do that. She described their friendship as being more mixed with appreciation, apprehension, closeness, despair, bitter hurt, and fragmented love than any other friendship she experienced. And interestingly, they both had this real commitment to incorporating heterosexual intimacy in their work, but when it came to their friendship, there were a lot of long-lasting tensions and arguments. She did not feel embattled, put upon, fogged over, those are her words, in any relationship with her male lovers, but her friendship from Brakhage neither benefit from the kind of affinity of gender that she felt with female artists or the kinship generated by sexual intimacy that she had with her partners. I would argue that it's, rather than thinking of Brakhage and the great man theory of art as, this solitary genius and a pantheon of other male artists, it's actually the friendship between Schneemann and Brakhage that had such an enormous influence on the development of post-war aesthetics. Brakhage moved towards an investigation of eros in his cinema of the late 50s, and Carolee Schneemann and James Tenney played pivotal roles as both filmic doubles and provocative alternatives for Stan and Jane. So before Stan Brakhage turned the camera on his and Jane's sexual relationship, he was using Schneemann and Tenney as sort of doubles, screen doubles, that allowed him to explore intimate, sexually explicit acts. And we see here, I'm sorry, a very not explicit still from Loving, but these days it's what you can find on the internet while you're taking the train to Toronto. So, uninteresting shot of James Tenney's foot. And in Cat's Cradle from 1959, which along with Brackage's films Daybreak and White Eye were shot in Schneemann and Tenney's Vermont home. And Schneemann and Tenney became sexual conduits through which Brakhage could explore the relationship between sex and cinema as two intricately related forms of embodied experience. Both Cat's Cradle and Loving fantasize a utopian sexual symbiosis between man and woman. And his fluid treatment of bodies suggests the interpenetration of male and female, this is a quote from P. Adam Sidney, creating an androgynous being out of discrete individuals. But this fantasied hermaphroditic merging was not replicated off screen in the film's mode of production, nor in the couple's interminglings, which Schneemann humorously described later as intermanglings. By diverting attention away from the conflict between these couples and the conflict within the couples to the sumptuous rhythms of natural light, Brakhage evaded the gendered issues that made the friendships between the couples so problematic. Though Schneemann had willingly participated in Brakhage's pursuit of visualized sexual self-definition, she came to disavow Brakhage's representation of her in both films. Like Cat's Cradle, Schneemann wrote, Loving was an extremely frustrating event in which I felt repressed, witnessed, appreciated, but constrained. And for Schneemann, these tensions in the foursome were epitomized by details of the film's mise-en-scène that willfully distorted the more egalitarian terms of domestic life practiced by Schneemann and Tenney. And here, in a sort of beautiful still from the film, we see Jane Brakhage and the cat, and they are sort of equated. Women are equated in this film as these mysterious, mystical, natural beings who exist in a way outside of time, like the cat. For Schneemann, the entire filming of Cat's Cradle turned into, quote, a nightmare of willful distortion and destruction. Stan wanting me to paint in the apron, an apron his mother sent for Christmas, and Jim posed like a decoy. Their nervous jumping, skin-crawling actions in the house so that all was chance in it and all that was intent by us became a melodramatic trapping as a trap for them. And one of the things that we see in this it's not a parody, but to contemporary audience, it's a beautiful film, but the gender relationships feel parodic because you see Stan and Jim Tenney sort of sitting at the table, writing, having these sort of deep moments of self-grappling as artists. Stan, very serious. And then you see Jane and Carolee chopping onions and cooking, and there were these really famous shots, which I couldn't find on the internet, of Carolee's painting, and Stan's making her wear this flowered apron, even though she never would have worn that, and she's chopping onions, and she was incensed that he made her appear in this stereotypically domestic garb, regardless of whether she's peeling onions or painting. And she joined feminists of her generation in finding the apron a loaded symbol of gender inequity. She felt used and deformed by the production. We're going to be watching a film of Jane Brakhage by Barbara Hammer. I'm very excited it's included in the program. But Carolee's own perceptions of Jane were really ambivalent during this time. She regarded Jane alternately as an ally, as an adversary, and as a mystery. And her observations of Jane were really crucial to her development of a feminist consciousness. I would say equally influential to her revelatory discovery of Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, because in Jane and Stan's relationship, she felt like she perceived firsthand the inequities that Simone de Beauvoir, also writing about being half of a power artistic couple, was writing about following a visit by Stan and Jane in 1958, after Loving was filmed, but before the real agonies of Cat's Cradle. Schneemann described her response to the intermangling of the two couples. She felt that she had a lot in common with Jim Tenney and Stan on the basis of their shared pursuits as artists, but she was always sort of being shoved into the kitchen along with Jane, and of course Jane was a writer as well, and she felt like Jane was inhabiting this domestic role, and Carolee, because of her gender, was being thrown along with it. And she both identified with Jane and radically disidentified with her, whom she witnessed disappear under the cloak of Stan's art and the dutiful fulfillment of her roles as wife and mother. And in a very powerful letter from the period, she reflected upon Jane's paradoxical embrace of traditional domestic duties in the midst of this post-war struggle to redefine femininity on equal terms with masculinity. And she talks about, like, when there were no pies and you couldn't go to the supermarket, then it was important to make pies. But in the age in which they lived, why was Jane making pies? Why was Jane having so many children if the family didn't need all the kids to sustain themselves? And she says, now woman chooses the natural, but it is not truly to be chosen. For the process itself is one of selfless non-individualization. It is forever given, then to extend the boundaries of all hoods, parenthood, wifehood, lifehood, hood, as what covers. For him, for Stan, she is another vast enterprise of his feeling, his needs, and his will. He is everything for her. For MJ, Mary Jane, Brakhage, all she desires and needs depends on him, and when one needs a great deal, one takes. His teaching her, his preparing her for what he needs, a nurse, a mother, a wife, lover, child, domestic, maid, teacher for the children. This is a beautiful and terrifying amount of need, and an ennobling amount to her, but here is the treachery that it all comes on his terms. Now there's the mysterious Jane, but then just to offer a visual counterexample to what Schneemann is talking about, Jane disappearing into motherhood and wifehood, in many ways they had a kind of shared responsibility for the filmmaking, as we see here from an image in Brakhage's scrapbook. Scheemann rejected the mantle of motherhood, whose reflection she found so distressing in Jane, and she fought against all forces that had the potential to derail her focus on art, including procreation. But on the occasions when she became pregnant, Jim Tenney supported her decision to have abortions, but Brakhage was less amenable. And he raged at her abortion, arguing astonishingly, and this is a quote from Carolee's recollections, "That baby belongs to Jim and me." Brakhage's reaction was so vexing that Tenney cited it as the grounds for the necessary redefinition of their friendship. It's possible to think of the films in which Schneemann and Tenney starred as serving a kind of outlet to satisfy what we would call the more homosocial forms of desire that between men. Oh, that's Jane. That's Jane in the mantle of motherhood with her big swollen belly. Beautiful painting by Carolee. It's possible to think of these films as a conduit for Brakhage and his longtime high school friend James Tenney to explore their own forms of intimacy that were prohibited between heterosexual friends. And so here's this very erotic, beautiful shot of James Tenney from Loving. Through Schneemann's nude body, Brakhage and Tenney were able to explore forms of sensual communion that neither of them could admit to desiring. Though it didn't diminish her sense of being instrumentalized by the films, Schneemann came to recognize the role that she played as a queer conduit between her male lover and his best friend. One of her paintings of Jim Tenney with the cats. Since Stan was Jim's closest friend and identified with the progress of his life since high school, there was ambiguity as to which of us was the sexual focus of his conscious, unconscious desires and identifications. Did Stan come closer to Jim through his sexual acceptance of me with him? Did he feel any erotic bond to me through his affection for Jim? Were we together symbolic of something as yet unrealized in his own experience? The genital taboos between the men were stronger than any for me, or than for me and Jim. I became the vehicle through which the men revealed as much as possible of their developing erotic natures. Dissatisfied with Brakhage's representation of her sexuality and subjectivity, Carolee Schneemann set to work on Fuses, which we're going to see today, an erotic film essay of her and Tenney's lovemaking that she shot and edited between 1964 and 1967. And here's a shot of Carolee and Jim from the 50s and a shot of them in the film. Schneemann was explicit about her decision to make the film as a reaction against Brakhage's misrepresentation of her own sexuality, as well as his appropriation of the female experience of childbearing in his classic Window, Water, Baby Moving. I wanted to see the fuck, she wrote, love-making's erotic, blinding core apart from maternity-paternity. In its explicit documentation of sexuality, unbound by either phallocentric conventions of fetishizing the woman or the ideological mantle of reproduction, Fuses explores the sensual pleasures of intersubjective interpenetration that could only be activated within an egalitarian heterosexual relationship. In doing so, the film posits a utopian alternative to the kind of idealized or frozen forms of gender and sexuality that were explored by Brakhage in his representations in the late 50s of heterorelationality. How are we doing on time, Chris? Okay, great. So I have this beautifully written description of Fuses that I'm not going to read because you're going to see it. That's sort of for people who don't have the chance to see it. So as you're going to see, Fuses celebrates a form of egalitarian, non-reproductive sexuality that liberates its performers from the cat's cradle of patriarchy and its domestic entrapment of women. The film chooses sensual immersion over scopic mastery. So rather than seeing the fuck as if you would see it from a pornographic film where it's been lit and shot for maximum visibility, Schneemann is really putting us inside of sexuality, and that's why I emphasize this notion of the blinding core of sensuality, seeing the sexual experience as if from the inside. So as you see in these film strips, it's not always so clear, right, what we're watching, but there's this great, sometimes it is, don't be disappointed, but there's this real intensity of the haptic image, the layered image, and the film was so heavily collaged when Schneemann first made it. She threw acid on it, she painted it, she collaged it, she stamped it, she baked it, she burnt it, that it was so thick and laden with the kind of traces of haptic visuality that when she first went to print it, it was too thick to go through the printer, and she was devastated and had to redo sections of it. Too densely collaged to run through the lab's printer, Fuses palimpsest documents sex from the inside of pleasure, suspended in this throbbing extensivity. I remember poet Stanley Kunitz's admonition to live in the layers, not in the litter. Schneemann, to many of us watching Fuses for the first time after being exposed to Brakhage, big chunks of Brakhage's oeuvre, it looks like a film that's heavily influenced by Brakhage. We see recurring images of light streaming through a window, which we identify as a Brakhage signature, changing foliage, tangled sheets that are situating sexuality simultaneously in the realm of domesticity and the natural world. Here we see Carolee sitting in front of the window. But rather than fetishizing domesticity, as Brakhage had done in Cat's Cradle, Schneemann incorporated these typically feminine labors into the process itself, that process of collage that I just described, in a way that evidences more authentically than the tropes of Cat's Cradle the way formal strategies employed by female artists coincide with other forms of experimentation practiced in a home studio. Schneemann's relationship with James Tenney served as a model for the kind of collaboration and cohabitation that was, in its egalitarianism, was relatively unique in the 1950s and 60s. And Schneemann often wondered whether Brakhage was threatened by that kind of equitable domestic and erotic intimacy. The accusations implied by Brakhage, she writes, are those which our love is based on and which Stan could never bear for himself. So he pretends it is also impossible, really, for Jim and that I have done it, our equality. And this equality means we share petty things and help each other, which he would never do. And the basic orders of domestic routine are suspect by them as we come more and more to take them easily and with certain pleasures. Over the years, Schneemann's angst over her friendship with Brakhage came to serve as a model for the kind of misrecognitions of the anatomical distinctions between the sexes that so often ruptures what would otherwise be the political camaraderie of left-leaning male and female artists. But when Brakhage died in 2003, it provided Schneemann with a new opportunity to both pay homage and to reckon with some of the frustrations that had long defined their friendship. She recalled points of contention in her relationship with Brakhage. She returned again and again to the apron, which was from Cat's Cradle, which was something she couldn't get out of her mind, and which remained a latent symbol of those gender inequities that had been insufficiently dismantled between them. As hosts and guests, she recalled on the occasion of Brakhage's death, we struggled over who empties overflowing ashtrays. How do we share? Who shops, cooks, washes up? You announce a profligate devotion to having babies, though you had no way to support them. You rage at my abortion. That baby belongs to Jim and me. I had to paint. For Cat's Cradle, you insisted I wear the silly apron Jim's mother had sent for Christmas. One of the most difficult things was that Brakhage's adherence to Freudian notions of sexual difference functioned as this real sort of chasm in their relationship. And Schneemann recalled, in those years, your objections to my despair over women artists as marginal tokens, in spite of the fact that you championed Gertrude Stein, Maya Deren, Marie Mencken, H.D., you and Jane burnt the copy of de Beauvoir's The Second Sex I sent for a revelatory, I hoped, 1959 Christmas present. You were outraged by my notes on gender exclusions. My letters to you were cut up and burnt so that only certain acceptable paragraphs remained in a scrapbook. And she talks about, the visits in the early 1950s where Brakhage would be so interested in what Jim Tenney was composing, and he wouldn't even go and see her best paintings that she were working on. And she thought in 1959, after a particularly painful visit, that she had seen Brakhage for the last time. And she agonized about that. She agonized about this sense that this was their final farewell because of the fights. I'm afraid we have seen Stan perhaps for the last time. If that is in itself true, it is terrible with the consequences of not knowing any more about them, where they go, how they are, which in my way of never losing love's concern, even when the love is not presently active, is a cruelty. And not to see the films. But there is a point where it is no longer possible to say it is because of the art of each other that we weather all personal difficulties. It is the person who makes the art, but the person first, perhaps. There were times that Brakhage responded to Schneemann's accusations. That letter from 1959 turned out to be, one of the many false endings of their friendship, and they did remain friends for more than 40 years. Schneemann always alleged that he didn't show fuses, that he didn't respect it, that he couldn't see it, even though he did show it to his classes. And he said, I'm a family man, there's just so many people I can look after, and felt like he had neglected Schneemann's work out of the sort of busyness of his own life. This is one of the rare moments in my writing where I quote from Brakhage defending himself and defending his support of Schneemann's work. But even in the defense, he continues to distinguish her from the handful of female filmmakers whose work he truly admired. As for the guilt, that's confusing, mixed up with the disturbances I have about fuses. I constantly have supported Maya Deren and Marie Menken while she was alive, and now Gunvor Nelson. I am unable to see the work of these three women in film, but while I've never excluded fuses and have in fact rented it and lectured on it, I do not really see it well. You know this, and it's perfectly imaginable to me that history, he's sort of deferring by not saying history, history, that's an awkward anachronism, will damn me for this inability, but there it is. All that I otherwise than family really support is that which I do fully recognize as art. And so even in his defense, he's admitting that he couldn't really recognize it. Later, though, he talked about how Schneemann had actually made him see how his own position of a kind of impoverished, fraught filmmaker trying to support a family was analogous to what women artists had struggled for. And this is the last quote I'll end with. I remember one of our arguments when Jane and I first came to visit began with my insistence that you realize the awful task men have been socially assigned, called making a living. I think we would not argue now. It is all the same enslavement which denies the uniqueness of the person. Hear ye, by the way. I have also wished to be supported, as do many women, willing to pay that exorbitant price, a being nothing there other than what the supporter wants. The economic supporters, mostly male, most obviously want to destroy the earth. What I'm trying to say is that I feel your book struggles for my freedom as well as your own and that of other women. I'm deeply grateful. So, things to keep in mind as we watch the program, the sort of important role Schneemann has as a predecessor to many of the filmmakers we'll watch today, and the very fraught relationship and how influential it was. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and it's great to be here. Thank you, Chris, for inviting me, and to TIFF for hosting me. It's great to meet and co-present with Ara, whose work I also follow because she's written about Brakhage and Schneemann's interesting contradictory relationship, which I am also kind of interested in, but in a different angle. So I'm going to put my stopwatch. Give me a second, so I'm not running out of time. I have no sense of time when I speak. Well, anyway. So yeah, I wanted to talk to you today about my practice and how I look at light. This quote that is printed at the top of the program by Jennifer Reeves, I just want to read that out because I really liked it. Some quality of light in the work of one filmmaker will inspire and open a door, permitting another to continue to push forward with their own work. This was the gift Brakhage's films gave to me. That's Jennifer Reeves. And I would say that Brakhage's films opened a door for me as well, and I walked in only to discover so many more filmmakers along the way, including Reeves herself, whose work spurred me on. Today I want to talk more about the quality of light that she is referring to and how I work with it, or how I think about it. And, these become my motivations as an artist. My PhD research focuses on the relationship of light as a material of cinema and breath as the material of the body, as we find in yoga practice. I was driven to these comparisons by watching the work of Brakhage and many other filmmakers who work with light in a particular way. I was also pushed in this direction because I'm a practitioner of yoga and have an experience of breath in a particular way. Prayoga is a word in Sanskrit for praxis, and it kind of describes practice in the sense that it is a critical and reflective practice. So that's how it's written in Devanagari script. And I bring up this word because it's useful to think about it in context of Brakhage's films and also experimental film in general, which is actually a practice. It's about doing. And the word has several connotations. Apart from practice, prayoga also means it has an expansive, domain. It could mean design, it could mean application, representation, exhibition. It could mean experiment. It could also mean experimenting. And this is why, this is how the word is when you break it up. Like if you deconstruct it, pra is like the prefix, which suggests forward, forth, in front, before, or onward. And yoga means to join, unite, integrate, and combine. It could also mean deep abstract meditation. It could mean contact and touch. It could also mean substance. And it could mean spell or magic or application and performance. So this word has a lot packed into it. And probably this is why Amrit Gangar, a film scholar from India, suggested that prayoga be an alternative to the word experimental. And he coined the term cinema of prayoga in 2005 at an experimental film festival in India called Experimenta. And he suggested this term, saying that cinema of prayoga is, probably a better way of thinking about experimental film, because experimental is an adjective, it's a qualifier. It involves a value judgment as to what is experimental, and what is not, and who makes those decisions. What are the power structures that decide where experimental film is from and what the framework is? So because of the coining this term, I want to read that quote out. Since the first explorations into the so-called experimental avant-garde underground film started in Western Europe and North America, naturally the relevant theories also emerged from there. Why so? Isn't experimentation intrinsically universal in one form or another? And, with this, what Gangar did was he challenged the dominant histories of experimental cinema in a way that saying that, what about what is experimental in the history of, for example, Indian film? So he was talking about the national film context of India and thinking about it in that context. But what I think is that there is a lot of potential for applying cinema of prayoga to cinema outside of the Indian context as well. And it could be used to, revisit American or North American or European experimental film history and to ask certain questions about how colonial domination and defined what the history of cinema is in colonized nations. And the other, which is why I'm interested in the cinema of prayoga as a means of looking at Brakhage's work and also the lineage of experimental film in North America. It's the currency of the term has not taken up very much, and it's regarded with skepticism. And it's because its international application has not yet really happened, which I hope to contribute to. And the other thing about cinema of prayoga is it really focuses on filmmakers' accounts of their own practice. And this lays an emphasis on practice-based research and on the filmmaker as a researcher or the filmmaker as an authority of knowledge and of practice as a form of knowledge, which is still a struggle to convince because we have very empirical notions about that. And so I will move to my next slide. Yeah. So going back to the word yoga, which exists within prayoga, that's a part of the term that I want to sort of build on because that's where my practice lies. It's at the intersection of cinema and yoga. And when I start thinking about it, I started being able to enter Brakhage's films because of my understanding of breath in yoga. So a little bit about yoga, which it is interdisciplinary. It doesn't exist on the binaries of what is science and what is art, and it is a philosophy, a science, a technology, and above all, it's an embodied practice that experiments with the body. The goal of yoga, as Patanjali, who established yoga and consolidated it in 400 CE, the goal of yoga is the cessation of the fluctuations of the mind. And in the original version of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, asana, which is physical posturing, is just a fraction of yoga. So it's also important to think about what is not yoga. Yoga is not necessarily the globalized version that we find today, which is largely hatha yoga or postural yoga. And the purpose of postural yoga is really just to bring you to a state where you can start doing breath work and where you can start thinking about meditation, but you cannot get there without first physically manipulating the body and then getting on to the next step, which is pranayama. So breath in yoga is really central to the practice. It's kind of the next level after asana. And pranayama, for those who would like to know the meaning, prana is life force in Sanskrit, and ayama in Sanskrit is regulation of breath, or extending and drawing the life force. So pranayama becomes then the practice of working with extending and drawing breath. And to me, this analogy is really like the way Brakhage extends and draws and works with light. I was introduced to Brakhage's films not very long ago. I mean, comparatively, because in India, we didn't really. I spent most of my life in India, and I have been in the US since 2015. First, I was at the Brakhage Center at University of Colorado studying his films and trying to see how watching his films could inspire my own practice. And as I said, that led me to a lot of other filmmakers as well, and the avant-garde as a whole. But the reason I say this is because I spent hours and hours watching Brakhage's films, end on end, and the quality of light definitely grasped me, but also I was very aware of my breath through these, as you watch these films, you can't help, but the awareness comes back to you. Maybe it's the quality of Brakhage's film that draws attention to breath, and I don't think the two are separate. So a couple of things about breath would be that you begin focusing attention on breath as part of yoga practice, and you become aware of its presence. And Luce Irigaray, the famous feminist scholar and philosopher, she says, awareness of the breath allows us to attend to our bodies and the bodies of others, to animals, nature, and other cultures, oppressed minorities, and the other of sexual difference. So, there is an intersubjectivity and a quality of breath that it flows through and beyond. There are different types of breath that the practitioner experiments with to alter their own state of being, which you're taught as techniques in yoga. Tracing breath through the body is part of the practice, and it allows for an exploration of the corporeal body, but using interior vision. Regulation of breath is practiced through inhales, exhales, and holds. So there's a certain sense of taking in breath, taking out breath, and pausing on it. And there's also the whole aspect of sound, because often when you're focusing on breath, there's an auditory component, which I find that a lot of discussion on the avant-garde is generally so focused on what is visual. The primacy of the visual is astonishing. There's very, in comparison, there's little work done to how sound works. Why is it just light? Do we just feel cinema with our eyes? So that's something that I keep asking myself. So breath becomes a measure of time for movements to occur. And I see it happen in Brakhage's films. Breath has interiority, exteriority, intersubjectivity, as I said. There's musicality of breath, its rhythms, its textures, its tones, and intensities. And once breath has anchored your practice while you are doing yoga, you also start becoming aware that there's an absence of awareness of breath. So you move away from that awareness, and you move beyond the corporeal idea of breath, where you're just trying to trace it, track it, see where it's going. After a point, it just doesn't matter because you've reached another point. And so ultimately, the meditation itself that begins to take place through any kind of immersive practice, such as yoga, the meditation itself, or dhyana as we call it in Sanskrit, focuses on sensory awareness of the breath, but remaining focused on it to eventually achieve a state of complete absorption or samadhi, where the practitioner and the object of meditation merge into one. It is a state of being totally aware of the present moment, a one-pointedness of the mind. So the goal of yoga, in simple words, is transcendence from matter to spirit. And this is also the goal of art praxis. So when I look at Brakhage's work, and a lot of the works of filmmakers who sit in this, who share affinities with Brakhage, I find that the way breath moves through the body in yoga is so similar to the way light moves in time and in movement in these films. And just as breathwork is foundational to the practice of yoga, shaping light is a function of Brakhage's cinema. Brakhage saw the filmmaker as a collector of light and a conditioner of the light entering the magic box that can be speeded up or down, opened or closed, as the case may be. So I started equating, watching Brakhage's film, I started equating the taking in of light or the light opening up as a sort of an inhale. And, you could think about the reduction of light, or the emergence of darkness as an exhale, and maybe there are pauses. I mean, the ways of thinking about it, which came to me as I felt like I was breathing with Brakhage's cinema when I was, watching these films. And his cinema is an embodied cinema. It's a text of light, to use his own words, and a way of. So what my research is really now looking at is breath and light as materials in two independent embodied practices, how they are manipulated through time and movement to lead to a certain result. So, moving through time, like breath as a measure actually determines, in yoga, when you're breathing, your movement is directed by the breath. So if you're inhaling, your movement is actually as long as the breath can hold you, and it's interesting to think about how Brakhage's camera work and how he moves with his breath, not only as a filmmaker, but also, how the camera as a body of its own. So there's human, there's apparatus, all this moving together to capture and collect light, the way breath is collected and channelized through the body. So eventually all this mediation leads to, transformation from matter to spirit, a sense of awareness, experience, and what I say well-being. Now, this might be sounding like I'm really stretching it, but no, Nathaniel Dorsky, who is very much has been inspired by Brakhage and shares his own affinities with Brakhage. Nathaniel Dorsky is an experimental filmmaker, and I've watched his films, and he talks about well-being and how cinema can essentially be related to our well-being. He's written this, he's published his talk called Devotional Cinema, and talks about how there is this transformation that takes place. I will read a quote of his, shortly, actually it'll come a bit later. But essentially, what is it about Brakhage's cinema and yoga? The end result is really a desire for radical autonomy and freedom, which happens both in the avant-garde, but it also happens with the practice and experiments that you do with your own body. I wanted to also, now bring in this quote and say that Nathaniel Dorsky, he thinks of cinema as a direct and intimate metaphor or model for our being. It has the potential to be transformative, to be an evocation of spirit, and to become a form of devotion. And isn't that interesting how his idea of devotion is not religious in the sense that it subscribes to any particular religion, but he talks about it in a sort of a spiritual way that could be interpreted by any as they wish. So I will come to this topic of the camera eye, which is a famous analogy. When we think about cinema, and what are the metaphors of the body that we use in cinema? The camera eye is the most obvious one, where we relate, how the retina is a screen, the rods and cones, we relate the rods and cones of the eyes to the light intensities of film grain, or we think of the lens in the camera as the eye, the pupil as the, shutter. And the function of seeing is, like William Weiss in his book, Light Moving in Time, Studies in the Visual Aesthetics of the Avant-Garde, he says, he discusses several male filmmakers and talks about embodied cinema. And he brings up the dialectic of the eye, which is, again, like Ara was saying, located in a certain body, which is very limited. I mean, this body has no gender, and it's divorced. It's a biological body, by default male, probably a scientific body. And the notion of dualism in Western philosophy, thanks to Descartes, has really caused a lot of trouble. And what I find is that it might be helpful to think of the body drawing in from other traditions of philosophy. For example, the yogic body has so many layers and so many nuances to it. Energy moves from the subtle body to the gross body to the subtle body. There are sheets. You are multiple bodies at the same time. These images are just like popular images I would have found, but they kind of can condense what is possible if you thought of the yogic body as a model for the body in embodiment. When we talk about embodiment in cinema, why do we choose such a limited model which cannot even offer us the imagination that these filmmakers offer us through their films? So here we have levels of energy which can be channeled in certain ways within a certain sphere. And you also have the idea of the cosmos within the body. In ancient Indian philosophical, medical, and mythological traditions, the human body was conceived of as a smaller replica of a macrocosm of which it is part. And so the body exists in multiple states of being. The universe exists within the body. The human body, there is no concept of human and non-human. I mean, looking at that image or this, I mean, there are the entire universe, planets, plants, animals, matter, elements, everything has been thought of and built into these mythological models of the body. Why do we necessarily reject them out of, probably because of the fear of, is this a religious concept or something? But I think they offer a lot more. These are miniatures. So the first one's a miniature from Mughal painting style from the 19th century. There was recently an exhibition on the Ayurvedic models of the body in the UK, and so that was actually on display at one of the galleries. And this is a cosmic map of the city of Varanasi. So the idea of the body is not limited only to the human body, or it's also mapped onto cities where the city becomes a body, spaces become bodies. So the body is extremely flexible, and you can do with it as you wish. So thinking about these models for me was more, it helped me grasp experimental film in a completely different light, where I was able to, through the practice of yoga, understand light as breath and breath as light. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us, Izabella, as well. Why don't we start with you, just because you made this film in 2002, and if I'm correct, you had a chance around that period to meet Stan, and you were, from my perspective, I thought you were during that time very inspired by him as an artist. And if you wanted to talk about a little about that, and also the film, it's radiograms. It's basically, and so there's this nice corporal light being made through the corpus, right? Yeah. That I think we can pull out of both Carolee's work and also Kalpana's work, and so please.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for including this film and for an opportunity to see it again, and to see it in this program. In particular because Stan's and Carolee's works have been very important to me. You're absolutely right. In 2002, I was very much immersed in Stan Brakhage's work. And Kalpana, when you were talking about watching Brakhage's work, you certainly become attuned to the rhythm of these works, I used to get to the point where I couldn't watch regular television because it just wasn't moving, it just lacked this dynamism. But what I found always very important about Stan's work is how much attention he paid to rhythm and to this kind of pre-linguistic thinking. Those were the things that really appealed to me. It was interesting to watch Barbara Hammer's film right now. I've never seen it before on Jane. And when Jane was here in Toronto at Innes College, I went actually to her talk. And she was actually speaking about how she does not think in language, and it requires this kind of translation into verbal form for her to be able to express. This is exactly what she repeated again at the end of the film. I always thought that this was Stan's thing, but nonetheless, it was certainly something that had appealed to me. Partly because I'm in the same way, and I could never explain it very well to others. I mean, there are different schools of thought. Some are divided that there is no such thing as thinking without verbal language. And that's very much a 20th century, I would say, idea where language just becomes the be-all and end-all. And it's interesting to see that ideas of visual thinking and other modes of thinking have kind of become more prevalent recently. And a lot of this is also through studies in disabilities, autism in particular. So there was this aspect that has really struck me about Stan's work, and maybe I should also frame it that I was at a time in 2002, 2 years prior, I was working with Bruce Elder I was assisting him on his book, the Stem Brakhage in the American Tradition of Gertrude Stein, Pound, and Charles Olson. So through that, I also had tremendous exposure not only to his writings, to his films, but also of these poets. So, and what was interesting about them, and maybe this will be useful for you, Kalpana, is the poetry of Charles Olson. And there's an interesting story about Schneemann and Brakhage that actually went to visit him in Gloucester. You probably remember that. So, and that was not what Schneemann had expected. But beside that, Olson's work had certainly, you certainly see an influence on that in Schneemann's, I would say, performative work, even more so. And Brakhage as well, and the idea that the line begins with a breath and ends with a breath. I think it was a very profound manifesto that he wrote about open field poetry. So I guess a lot of these things were just kind of percolating in me. I've also known Jim Tenney. He used to teach at York University, so I've always had a different context of knowing Jim. And in fact, there was a screening of Fuses, and you can certainly see the way that Schneemann captures his penis in a specific way. I mean, it glistens. This is certainly not something you would ever see in porn, and this is part of the reason why perhaps a lot of men didn't really care for it. And also flaccid penis. But anyways, he was sitting behind me with his wife, new wife, when the film was being screened, and this was part of another book by Elder. And I just remember thinking to myself, this is very awkward. He's seeing his penises all the time, and his previous wife. Okay. I don't know how I follow this up. It's, I guess it is pretty funny. I did have, I must say, always this a bit of an ambivalent relationship with Stan. He was very generous to younger filmmakers. And younger female filmmakers, Mary Beth Reed, who started working with him, doing optical printing. I believe Jack Bush, who was his printer, retired. And some of the films he made actually was, he would actually credit Mary Beth Reed and him. He also was good friends with Garane Torosian, a filmmaker of my generation. And he met her at Telluride Festival. And they've remained friends. And in fact, he introduced me to her. And he thought, you guys make good friends. And I must say that I did find a lot of, after Stan passed away, finding out about his views on abortion and about how uneasy Schneemann felt about being judged by him, somewhat troubling. And for me, trying to make peace with that has been in many ways difficult. In part because on one hand, he was certainly somebody who championed, I would say, younger filmmakers, and also many of the filmmakers and poets who inspired him were women, including Stein. And so this idea that, he would feel this way about it, I found troubling. I guess I try to think of it also in a broader context of him being an orphan and he was adopted. So this idea might have even resonated deeper with him of the fact that he could have been aborted. But that could have been him. What's troubling, I think, also is towards the very end of his life, he kept on talking about his mother that he's never met. And some of his latest, the final drawings or paintings he made that were published in a journal are actually self-portraits, and where he had this dream that he wrote down where he actually enters a hallway and meets his mother for the first time that he's never met. So I think that Brakhage himself had a very difficult relationship, or I would say an ambivalent relationship towards women. On one hand, I would say that they inspired him and he supported many. On the other hand, there was this other side, as Ara mentioned, and I certainly found out. But sometimes I like to think that it's better not to know artists. We should judge them based on their work. And I must say, one of the person who said that was Martin Heidegger, whose philosophy hasn't been taught for a very long time because of his alliance with Nazis. So, I don't know. Maybe I should pass this on. I've been talking for too long.
Well, we do only have time for a couple of questions, so I'm going to cede the floor to two people.
Okay. Let's get a mic to you.
I see a hand with a scarf.
Here you go. They're going to give you a microphone.
And there's a mic.
Great. Hi, thanks everyone. I was really struck by the comments about the connection between yoga and film before the screening, and what it brought to mind was the notion put forward by Krishnamacharya that asana and pranayama are sadhana, things that you can do, but that meditation is a siddhi, which arises spontaneously as a fruit of the sadhana. And so what I was thinking throughout the screening actually was, if there is a similar kind of distinction in either viewing film or watching film between what we could call in yoga sadhana and siddhi, specifically what would the dimension of siddhi or the dimension of meditation be, and how does either the viewer or the maker get to that point?
I think it's a process of entwining between the spectator and the film. Vivian Sobchak talks about the reciprocity of, between the spectator and the film. She's in Carnal Desires, and I feel like the sadhana part the part of getting to, the sadhana part of it would be actually just flowing with the film, because you're tracing light by watching it. And the film itself offers you doors to enter and weave through, its pacing, its rhythm. I guess it's just about focusing your attention to, make that connection with the film. And I remember Phil Solomon told me in Boulder, like, this was one of the things, his oft-repeated line was that a good film is one that lets you be yourself, It doesn't want to take over and superimpose itself on you. So I feel like, I guess the sadhana would be to just let yourself be you and let the film be itself, and to have that conversation going on between the two of you by just simply your breath and the light in the film. And there is an alchemy that happens, with that. And it's only possible if the film has material that is, the materiality of the film merges with its content or subject, and I feel that can get you to a point where you've forgotten everything and you're with it. You merge with the film as a spectator.
All right, we have time for one more question. Is there any questions? Oh, on.
I didn't, the intro talk, you mentioned 1959 as a point where I'm wondering what their, Carolee's and Stan's relationship, what incidences or after 59, like in 89, I went to the Experimental Film Congress in Toronto. I mean, I live here, so I was here, and Tenny was here, and Brakhage, and Barbara Hammer, and when their marriage broke up, this is the second part of the question, did Jane have ongoing contact with the film people in Stan's life, like Carolee and others? What became her position?
I don't know. To the second part of your question, I don't know about Jane's contact. I know that she's done a lot of writing.
She didn't.
Yeah.
I mean, she talked about it.
But I'm actually not clear on what the first part of the question was. About 1959?
Because everything you described, but did they have ongoing contact, or
Oh, yeah.
did their relation? What was their, like, up to his death? What was the basis of their relationship, or their contact, or whether it was artistic or personal?
I mean, there were a lot of letters that remained. There were a lot of conversations that happened. I don't really know, like, how often they saw each other and at what events, but I know that those conversations persisted throughout the 60s, throughout the 70s. It's very interesting to look at this book that I mentioned, Correspondence Course, that anthologizes Carolee's letters, because you get a sense of the ongoing conversations, not only with Brakhage, but with other artists. But yeah, certainly they were in communication. It's unfortunate there's a Brakhage biography project that a bunch of us are trying to contribute to at the moment. David James, who just retired from USC out in California, he sort of called a bunch of Brakhage scholars together and said, there's like not really a biography about Brakhage right now. And while people are alive, everybody should be interviewed. And there certainly are a lot of interviews on the record already. And so I'm supposed to interview Carolee, and I haven't gotten to it yet. And it would have been amazing to do that before, this talk, but it hasn't happened yet. But she said she'll tell me everything she knows, right, about Brakhage. So I wish I could answer that question better about, precisely what their contact was, but I can't. Yeah.
Something to look forward to. We have to wrap it up. One thing to look forward to, if you can make the trek, Carolee is going to be presenting her work in Detroit as part of Media City on November 8th, Wednesday, November 8th. It's not too long of a drive to actually get to see a wonderful artist in her in person in her films. And if you were taken with especially Jennifer Reeves and Mary Beth Reed's films, the next Brakhage screening is on November 7th, concentrates on his painted films. And some of those are work that he actually, as Izabella mentioned, did with Mary Beth. And one of her collaborations with him is in there. But a really different notion of vision, the idea of closed-eyed vision, that he worked on, becomes very inherent in these films, and I very much recommend that you join us on November 7th. And thank the three of you for joining us today and all your insights into what you presented to us today. Thanks.